89.1 FM Rich Radio Hashtag Surmount Kalangitan Ka-Heaven.
Hello to all senior high school learners of Kalangitan High School. Magandang buhay sa ating lahat. I'm your Sir Mel Santos and welcome to another home study session in 21st century literature from the Philippines and the world. On the fifth of the 7-part series of virtual learning for our topic, 21st century literature traditions and forms from different cultures. So again, let's keep in mind our learning goals for the entire 7-part series of this virtual learning. Identify the 21st century literary traditions and forms of different cultures, notably African literature on this episode. Distinguish the differences of these 21st century literary traditions and forms of different cultures from their established or classical literary conventions, and appreciate the 21st century literary developments of different cultures. So mga ka-heaven, let's get started to roll. There are 54 nations which make up Africa. African literature was built upon the history of slavery, oppression, violation, and humiliation. Africa faced many hardships in its history, and its impact can be seen in the themes of literature. One hardship that led to many others is that of colonization of European powers and the Americas, which led to slavery. This colonization also resulted to African diaspora, which was more like a forced diaspora. Millions of African people were enslaved and brought to Western countries around the world from 16th and 19th centuries. So African people were sent to European countries and the Americas during this time to be sold as slaves. So those in the movies you might have seen wherein African people are being sold as slaves did happen in real life, brought about by this foreign colonization. The splitting of African people largely against their will is called the African diaspora. An explosion of African writing in European languages occurred in the mid-20th century as a result of the colonization in Portuguese, English, and French. So as a result of colonization, all Africans had been writing in Portuguese as early as 1850, and a few volumes of African writing in English and French had been published. In the 1930s, Black or Francophone intellectuals from French colonies living in Paris initiated a literary movement called Negritude. So this movement was primarily acted upon by African migrants to French colonies brought upon by the so-called African diaspora. If you remember in our discussion of Chinese literature, they do have this Sinophone literature phenomenon as well, which emerges in our present generation of 21st century, in which Chinese writers from outside China or migrants to a foreign land write literature in the Chinese language or that relates to Chinese culture. Sinophone literature of China is like the Negritude movement of Africa, in which writers from outside their homeland continues to write or create literary works that relates to their country of origin. But apparently, Negritude movement, which was initiated in the 1930s, emerged first than Sinophone literature of China, which is just new, or only emerged in our present generation of 21st century. Also, you might have noticed that Francophone term associated to the Black or African intellectual at the time who initiated the Negritude movement. Francophone is just like a fancy term for those African people, particularly the intellectuals settled in French colonies who could speak French fluently. Francophone is from the root word franco, referring to French, and phone is essentially a Greek word which means sound, voice, or speaker of. Thus, Francophone, when directly translated from these two root words, it means speaker of French. Similarly with Sinophone of China, Sino which refers to Chinese, it means speaker of Chinese. The difference with Sinophone and Negritude is Sinophone relates to those writers who speak Chinese but are not living in China but are also fluent of the language of the country they migrated in, say English if they are in America. While the Francophone term associated with the Negritude movement are those African writers who could speak French probably more fluently than their own African native language. But all the same, both Sinophone literature of China and the Negritude movement of Africa were caused by the same phenomenon of diaspora, or the movement, migration, or scattering of a people away from an established or ancestral homeland. African diaspora is particularly thought-provoking as it is often regarded as forced diaspora, or a movement away from their homeland against their free will. It was a kind of movement or migration riddled by slavery, or the so-called slave trade to Western countries, which started as early as 16th century, wherein African people were sold like commodities, like goods you buy in a grocery store. And they are sold so to be enslaved by those who purchase them, usually in plantations or households. Negritude movement emerged out of sudden grasp of racial identity and cultural values. Founders of Negritude movement tried to rediscover African values that had been erased by the French cultural superiority. Negritude writers wrote poetry in French and present African culture and tradition as contradictory or antithetical but equal to European culture. Negritude movement's founders are Aimé Césaire, Leopold Sédar Senghor, and Leon Gontran Damas. Some of the first African writings to gain attention in the West were the slave narratives. So when we say West, we are simply referring to the European and North American countries. Alright, so it was slave narratives that first gained attention in the West. So slave narratives are literary works in prose such as novels and short story about slave narratives. So these slave narratives vividly describe the horrors of slavery and the slave trade. Slave trade is essentially the root cause of African diaspora when they were brought to Western countries where they were sold like animals as household slaves. As Africans became literate in their own languages, they often reacted against colonial repression in their writings. After World War II, as Africans' demand for independence, more African writers' works were published. All of these writers were writing in European languages and often shared the same themes about the clash between indigenous and colonial cultures, condemnation of European colonization, pride in African past, and hope for the independence. So much of contemporary African literature reveals hopelessness and disagreement or a sentiment of protest against their current situation. Some of the famous writers from the contemporary period of African literature include Chinua Achebe, who is one of the world's most widely recognized and praised writers of the 20th century. His most famous novel, Things Fall Apart in 1958, is a devastating depiction of the clash between traditional tribal values and the effects of colonial rule, as well as the tension between masculinity and femininity in highly patriarchal societies. Ahikwe Arma's novels are known for their intense, powerful depictions of political devastation and social frustration in Arma's native Ghana, told from the point of view of the individual. His works were greatly influenced by French existential philosophers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, and as such hold themes of despair, disillusionment, and irrationality. His most famous work, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, published in 1968, centers around an unnamed protagonist who attempts to understand himself and his country in the wake of post-independence. Born in Somalia in 1945, Nuruddin Farah has written numerous plays, novels, and short stories, all of which revolve around his experiences of his native country. The title of his first novel, From a Crooked Rib, published in 1970, stems from a Somalian proverb: God created woman from a crooked rib, and anyone who tried to straighten it breaks it, and is a commentary on the sufferings of women in Somalian society through the narrative of a young woman trapped in an unhappy marriage. His subsequent works feature similar social criticism dealing with themes of war and post-colonial identity. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is one of Africa's most important and influential post-colonial writers. He began his writing career with novels written in English, which nevertheless revolve around post-colonial themes of the individual and the community in Africa versus colonial powers and cultures. Wa Thiong'o was imprisoned without trial for over a year by the government for the staging of a politically controversial play. After his release, he committed to writing works only in his native Gikuyu and Swahili, citing language as a key tool for decolonizing the mindset and culture of African readers and writers. Themes of 21st century African literature remains to be violence and cultural upheaval. These are topics present in previous centuries which are still very much relevant in modern-day African nations. Modern African writers look away from the internal individual struggle and instead shift the focus to the struggles of African nations still trying to develop after gaining independence from European imperialism, economic struggles of the people, divisions of classes, and various other conflicts that modern-day African nations face. So in our previous discussion of world literature and representative texts and authors, we have already been introduced by some of the 21st century African writers, including Aminata Forna, who first drew attention for her memoir, The Devil That Danced on Water, which was published in 2003, an extraordinarily brave account of her family's experiences living in war-torn Sierra Leone, and in particular her father's tragic fate as a political dissident. Forna has gone on to write several novels, each of them critically acclaimed. Her work, The Memory of Love, published in 2010, contrasts personal stories of love and loss within the wider context of the devastation of the Sierra Leone Civil War and was nominated for the Orange Prize for Fiction. One of the apartheid era's most prolific writers, Nadine Gordimer's works powerfully explore social, moral, and racial issues in a South Africa under apartheid rule. Despite winning a Nobel Prize in Literature for her prodigious skill in portraying a society interwoven with racial tensions, Gordimer's most famous and controversial works were banned from South Africa for daring to speak out against the oppressive governmental structures of the time. Her novel, Burger's Daughter, follows the struggles of a group of anti-apartheid activists and was read in secret by Nelson Mandela during his time on Robben Island. Originating from the Republic of Congo, Alain Mabanku's works are written primarily in French and are well known for their biting wit, sharp satire, and insightful social commentary into both Africa and African immigrants in France. So it's like the 21st century Francophone writer or one of the Negritude advocates during the 1930s. His novels are strikingly character-focused, often featuring ensemble casts of figures, such as his book Broken Glass, which focuses on a former Congolese teacher and his interactions with the locals in the bar he frequents, or his novel Black Bazaar, which details the experiences of various African immigrants in an Afro-Cuban bar in Paris. Ben Okri's childhood was divided between England and time in his native Nigeria. His young experience greatly informed his future writing. His first highly acclaimed novels, Flowers and Shadow in 1980 and The Landscapes Within in 1981, were reflections on the devastation of the Nigerian Civil War, which Ockrey himself observed firsthand. His later novels met with equal praise. The Famished Road in 1991, which tells the story of Azaro, a spirit child, is a fascinating blend of realism and depiction of the spirit world and won the Booker Prize. Alright, that ends the fifth of the seven-part series of virtual learning on 21st century literary traditions and forms from different cultures. See you on the next episode and bye for now mga ka-heaven.
89.1 FM Rich Radio Hashtag Surmount Kalamitan Ka-heaven